All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Retirement Village Residents Association of New South Wales webinar, Understanding Village Finances. My name's James Wiltshire, and I'll be the moderator today. I'm the Executive Director of the DCM Institute, a professional development organisation that specialises in the training and learning for retirement village professionals across the country. Before we begin today, I'd like to take a moment to pay my respects to the traditional owners on the land through which we all meet here today, and acknowledge elders past, present, and emerging. Today, we've come together to understand village finances. This is a webinar initiative put together by the New South Wales RVRA's Education Centre, led by Diane Hart, who will be joining us shortly. The main financial problems facing retirement village residents is a lack of transparency in budgets and exit fees, rising service charges, inadequate asset management planning, and inadequate cost burdens across villages. These issues have been constantly highlighted in the Retirement Village Residents Association notes, as well as some of the information that they collect from members across the year. They are a member-based organisation, and we thank them for their support in hosting this webinar here today. What we want to do today is speak to some people from across the spectre around clarity, collaboration, and compliance. Joining me across the webinar is Diane Hart, Chair of the Residents Association's Education Centre. I'll be introducing her shortly for her first presentation. We'll then be joined by Peter Hill, who's the Managing Partner of Hill & Co Lawyers, and Fiona Russell, a State Operations Manager in New South Wales for Levande. The purpose of what we're hoping to achieve is really help inform residents around their rights, their obligations, as well as some of the things that they should be mindful of to ensure that they are part of a transparent and clear budget process. Budget processes have begun in New South Wales, as we know, with many village managers and committees currently meeting to discuss what is intended to be proposed for the 26-27 financial year. Over the course of the presentation, the webinar here today, we will have the chat and the question and answer function available to us. What I would ask that over the course of the presentation, if you could put any questions that you have into either the Q&A box, which is preferred if you can see it, or if you can't see the Q&A function, which should be at the bottom, the chat function, I will be monitoring that over the course of the webinar. If for some reason I don't have the ability to get to one of your questions, please note the intent is to collect all of the questions. They will then be passed on to Diane following the webinar series. We have a second one next week. And the RVRA will endeavour to revisit those and come back to those who ask the questions. So we do have a question and answer session at the back end of this webinar. I estimate that we won't be able to get to everyone's question, but we do intend to follow up with them and get in contact with those who raised them. So thank you in advance for those of you who intend to participate over this morning's webinar. To kick us off, I'd like to welcome Diane Hart. Diane is the chair of the Residents Association's Education Centre and brings more than a decade of hands-on experience as a village resident and as well as a committee leader. Diane's a retired academic, so let's not hold that against her, and has lived in a retirement village for more than 11 years and served on the Residents Committee for 10, including as president for 6 years. Diane has been a great advocate for residents across New South Wales and across the country, and is very passionate about ensuring residents remain informed about their rights, their obligations, but also to ensure that retirement villages live up to the expectations that we all have when we move into them. So, Diane, I'm going to throw over to you for your first presentation, and good morning and welcome.
Thank you very much, James, and welcome everybody. Back in 2017, Catherine Greiner travelled across New South Wales listening to residents talk about their experiences in retirement villages. And when it came to village budgets and accounts, the message was loud and clear. Budgets weren't easy to understand, residents struggled to access information, and operators were often reluctant to share it. For many of you, that probably sounds familiar even today. Yes, some things have improved, but we still have a long way to go before village finances feel genuinely clear, collaborative, and compliant. So I want to start today with a quick snapshot of what the Retirement Village Residents Association, the RVRA, is still seeing 8 years on. Next slide, please. The RVRA has been supporting, informing and advocating for New South Wales retirement village residents since 1990. Every year, our inquiry desk receives around 400 to 500 calls from residents, and the graph on the left shows the pattern of these calls over the past 4 years. And you can see that there's a spike every May, right when most village budgets are released. We classify our calls into 15 categories. In 2025, the big four were management, finance and budgets, legislation, residents committees, and fair trading sees a very similar pattern with their inquiries. On the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see the breakdown for May 2025. Out of the 48 inquiries for that month, 36 were about finance and budgets, and they came from 21 different villages. Next slide. So when we look closely at those 36 finance-related calls, 4 themes stand out, and I'll walk through each one with a real example from our May inquiries. Now, there were 11 transparency cases. A common scenario is a sudden increase in a budget line item, but no explanation, no discussion, no access to quotes. In one village, the insurance line jumped significantly. The operator had quotes, but labelled them confidential, and the residents committee were told they couldn't see them. The committee accepted this, even though the legislation gives them the right to that information. So the main issue here was transparency, but the secondary issue was a committee not confident enough to insist on their rights. We had 10 cases where compliance with the legislation was the main issue. In another example, the residents from a metropolitan village raised concerns about how the budget meeting was handled. Now, their recurrent charges went up 8%. That's well above the Consumer Price Index, the CPI. But instead of a proper meeting, residents received a postal vote. There was no returning officer. The vote wasn't anonymous, and the manager counted the votes. Both the manager and the committee failed to follow the legislation. A variety of cost issues were at the root of 10 cases. We're seeing more residents struggle as the cost of living rises faster than their income. Many long-term residents live now on pensions, and affordability is becoming a real pressure point. One village charged the full wage of a staff member to the village budget, even though that staff member only worked with a handful of service departments residents. There were no residents committee. The fixed formula budget meant residents were deemed to have consented to the budget, so no one challenged it. And this brings us to the 4th theme, disadvantage, which I'll explore more in the next 2 slides. Next slide, please. Of the 4 inquiries listed as disadvantaged as the main issue, it's a small number, but in reality, disadvantage sits underneath many of the problems that residents face. Villages without residents committees lack the collective strength and structure needed to protect residents' rights. They're more vulnerable to poor communication, poor management, and poor outcomes. And more than half of the New South Wales villages have no committee at all. In our sample of 21 villages in May, 8 had no committee. And even in villages that did have committees, some weren't functioning well, not calling meetings, not negotiating with the operator, and not advocating for residents. And this came through very strongly in the last RVRA budget and AMP survey. One resident wrote, "We were not happy with the budget, but the residents committee hassled everyone to the point of capitulation. We are not allowed to have our own opinion. The committee's chair is a bully and made threats about the recurrent fees being increased." Next slide, please. There are other disadvantage issues. In our sample, 5 villages had fewer than 50 independent living units, and small villages often struggle to form committees simply because there's not enough willing volunteers. Even villages with under 100 units can find it difficult. In our sample of 13 villages with under 100 units, 6 had no committee. 7 villages were run by operators with only a handful of villages in New South Wales. 4 of those had no committee at all. This is not to say that all small villages or villages without residents' committees have problems. Many do not. And from our 2025 budget and the AMP survey, 24.2% of the villages in the survey, that's 39 out of 161, had their budget passed without any vote at all. Now, some of these disadvantages are systemic. They're not about individual choices or personalities. They're built into the structure of the system, the legislation, the processes, and the power dynamics. Every month, the RVRA sees inquiries that highlight the same 4 challenges. That's transparency, compliance, costs, and a range of disadvantaging factors. Next slide, please. As I've mentioned, the RVRA conducts an annual budget and asset management plan survey. So looking across the 4 years of the survey comments, the message from the residents is consistent. They want transparency, accountability, clear explanations of fees and charges, and reporting that isn't opaque or inconsistent. Affordability concerns are growing as recurrent charges rise, and residents also want stronger, more effective residents' committees that play a real role in budget oversight and communicate openly with residents. Next slide, please. With an ageing population, rising costs, and an affordable housing crisis, the retirement sector is facing significant financial pressures. To meet these challenges, we need reforms at the village level that focus on transparency, compliance, affordability, and equity. That means clearer budget disclosures, proper meeting procedures, stronger committees, better collaboration between managers and residents, and hardship protocols for long-term residents who are struggling. We've made progress since the primary report, but there's still a long way to go before residents feel that their village finances are genuinely clear and accessible. Thank you.
Yes, great. Thank you, Diane. And once again, thank you for the RVRA for putting on this webinar, your support and certainly your passion for helping inform, educate and lift the standards of retirement living across New South Wales. There's some excellent points here and I took a lot of notes and I'm really keen to explore some questions with you after we get through these next 2 presentations. Speaking of questions, it was great to see the Q&A section starting to flash up with some questions from those of you who are on this call. We've got close to 200 people, which is fantastic across the state of New South Wales. So please keep your questions coming in. I'm looking over them and noting them so that we get to them after we finish with Peter and Fiona's presentation. That takes me to Peter Hill. So Peter Hill's the managing partner of Hill & Co Lawyers, and Peter's been practicing law for some time now. And for almost 20 years, Peter's been working in the retirement village space very closely with retirement village residents to make sure that their rights are protected and that they move into the villages informed. Peter's been a great supporter of the RVRA for a number of years, and we're pleased to have him on the call here today. And we've invited Peter to come along and provide us with an understanding of what the legal framework is that's in place when it comes to finances in retirement villages. So Peter, welcome to the webinar, and I'll hand the podium over to yourself.
Thanks very much, James, and it's lovely to be here today. If there's one thing I would say is that the work of the Education Centre that Diane's leading for the RVRA is vital to improving the knowledge base for residents in villages, particularly around quite complex matters connected to the budgets. And I want to try as much as I can to get you across at the ground level what the finances of a retirement village are meant to look like and what the budgetary process is designed to do. So let me go to the first slide. Okay, so let's talk about budgets. Most people have got a household budget, and we look at revenue coming in and costs going out. In a retirement village, it's done at a more complex and advanced level. But it's very, very, retirement village really work. Now, operators are required to prepare quarterly and annual accounts of the income and expenditure. The village budgets lets residents know how their recurrent charges will be spent in the forthcoming year. We all know that we either pay fortnightly recurrent charges, some villages have monthly, and the money that the operator collects through the budgetary process or the approved budgetary process goes to pay for all of the maintenance in the village that they have to do in order to keep the village running. Where a budget's required is above 50K revenue, and operators must itemise the expenditure items. The operators must provide brief reasons for any changes year on year. So if there's been a change, for example, in the gardening costs or the cleaning costs, there should be some explanation in relation to why that's changed, whether that's gone up, and in those circumstances to give residents a better understanding of what's going on. Resident consent is required for an operator on an annual basis to approve the budget, generally, unless it's a budget that is a CPI budget, in which case they don't need resident consent. The special resolution is required for any variation in services or facilities. So if an operator is looking to change services or facilities and there are particularly cost implications, the special resolution is required of the operator for residents, and a special resolution requires at least 75% of those who vote. So what are some tips with the budget as an overview? One of the issues I see in budgets is sometimes the layout changes from year to year with operators, so that causes some problems with comparisons year on year. So it's important to try and keep the budget, if you like, the form and the nomenclature and the line items consistent through time, which helps with comparisons. And the other thing I think that's been a good development is the asset management plans that you can look at, that residents can look at, to determine what are the up and coming costs that an operator is going to face, particularly with projected costs around maintenance and capital replacement. Next slide, thank you. So what's in a budget? The budget's got to have the amount of recurrent charges. It's got to tell you what the calculation is and how they came to that amount, the total expected income, importantly, the total expenditure, the categories of expenditure, what they're going to spend on, whether it be, gardening maintenance to all types of different categories to maintain the village. Any expected surplus or deficit, very important. Is the village going to run with a surplus, or is it going to have a shortfall at the end of the financial year? Estimate of costs of proposed maintenance, and if there's going to be capital works fund contributions. And capital works fund contributions are usually money that is set aside in a specific fund to generally undertake long-term maintenance and help the village accumulate funds so that when things major need to get done, they've got money for a rainy day. Next slide. What's out? Okay, so what can't an operator put in a budget? Well, they can't claim the membership of their professional associations. They can't claim their overseas travel. They can't claim costs related to marketing and vacant units. Head office costs are not related to providing services to the village. Very, very important. A lot have been issues over the last few years around head office costs, and they go back probably 20 years. I remember doing cases on this. If an operator needs to charge for the head office costs, and with very large operators and the concentration of villages getting bigger, operators are tending to centralise things like HR, IT, and a whole bunch of other services that are provided to the village. They've got to show how those services actually relate to the village. And there are some payroll tax amounts that are not allowed in. What are some of the considerations here? Ultimately, the operator can charge costs, or generally can charge costs that are reasonable and necessary to maintain the village. And the New South Wales Civil and Administrative Tribunal has a role to play in arbitrating, being the arbiter of disputes and determining disputes between residents and the operator over disputes over budgets generally. Okay, next slide. So, importantly, resident consent to budgets. Generally, consent is required, but not where current charges have not been changed year on year. or where recurrent charges are according to a fixed formula. Some villages have recurrent charges fixed against the CPI or the age pension, whichever is the greater thereof. Some have other different formulas. Generally, consent to a budget is not required where there are changes to the budget within the consumer price index movement. How's resident consent given? Well, within 30 days after budget papers are delivered, residents must hold a meeting and vote. The meeting is to be organised, very importantly, to pick up on Diane's early point, organised by the Residents Committee, and it's a majority of 50 plus one needed to agree to pass a budget. Next slide. Transparency of budget information, very, very important. In my experience over the last 20 years, I've seen issues that percolate to the top, and often in NCAT where committees, residents committees haven't been provided with sufficient information to justify costs. Residents Committee can request an operator to provide additional information to help with provide requested information within 10 business days. And I think this is an area that, working together, the committee and the operator should be able to come to a win-win. There's often times where operators will declare, particularly with some quotations, that there's some sort of commercial in confidence with the information. But I think that it's important that the residents and the operators sit down around the table and try and nut out why it's increased this way or how's the cost justified. And I think with open dialogue, which is the key to trying to resolve some of the issues between Residents Committee and the operators on this front. Next slide. So where do you go to resolve the disputes? Well, firstly, the Residents Committee really have the primary jurisdiction to question budget items. The year-on-year increases that arise usually create some questions or issues, particularly given what we've seen with inflation and not in the rising costs of insurance and other items. I think it's behoving on operators and residents to see where they can reduce costs responsibly, given the cost of living crisis in this current environment, and that's got to be done responsibly. Obviously, residents want to maintain the services and the operators have got to cover the costs of maintaining the village, so there's got to be a balance. There's important for residents and operators really to ensure that expenses are really necessary, and where they can find some cost efficiency, where there's a win-win on all sides, that should be done. And ultimately, the New South Wales Civil and Administrative Tribunal is the arbiter on those disputes. Next slide. So what happens if there's a surplus or a deficit? Well, the surplus is carried over year on year, or residents can have that surplus, can consent to have the funds returned or spent on particular items within the village. The operator generally must meet costs of deficit, with some exceptions. There's a few exceptions where the operator is not required to meet the deficit. For example, if costs of essential services increase unexpectedly during the year. But as a general rule, where an operator runs a deficit in a village, that deficit must be paid for by the operator, with some exceptions. Next slide. Thank you. Importantly, appointing an auditor, and this has been one of the big changes that we've seen in recent times with legislation, which I think has added a lot of benefit to residents. And I think the whole issue of having a resident consent annually to an auditor being appointed and can choose their auditor has led to a lot more analysis of annual accounts and helped residents in the budgetary process generally. The auditor is generally approved at the same time as the budget, and if there's a dispute over who the auditor is, the NCAT can decide as to who should be the auditor when in dispute. But it's a very, very important function, and it's a function, I think, year on year that adds to the budgetary process where it's been done properly. Next slide. Thank you. So, conclusion. I think one of the big challenges that we've had across villages is getting mechanics of how the villages run. It can be complex, but at the end of the day, it's their bottom line and their hip pockets that are being affected. It's also the operators in many respects where the budgeting process is not done as well as it should be. There's certainly a mandate in the legislation to request information, and residents can when the budget, proposed budget, is unclear. It's very important for residents to compare expenditure year on year and ask the question, why did it go up? Why is that increase? Is it necessary? And I would say be involved, because being involved, you have more of a stake in the outcomes. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Sorry, just trying to find the mute button and the video buttons we turn off and flick through the screen. So thank you for that presentation. I'm sure I'm starting to see a lot of questions come in, which is great. A point that was raised, which I'm going to note now, was that it turns out we've got a few people from interstate sitting on this call, which is great to see. I think this is a great initiative. The purpose of this really is to look at village finances and village budgets from the lens of New South Wales. The Retirement Village Act across this country is state-based, and there are idiosyncrasies in each state across the country. It's great to have you joining us if you're from another state, but just please take note that some of the very particular elements of the process, whether it be around the time frames, how the committee structures work, how the meeting structures work, they'll be very New South Wales based, and it's important that if you have a question that relates to your state, I'd encourage you to reach out to your Residents Association representative in your particular state to ask a question of them. And that's an excellent point from someone on the call, so thank you. Now we want to look at it from an operator's perspective, and we've got Fiona joining us from Lavande. So Fiona's the State Operations Manager with more than 20 years experience across property, finance and retirement living. And it's very good to have her with us today. So she's going to talk to us from an operator's perspective, just around the budget process, really coming to these points of transparency, clarity, but more importantly, working with residents in a partnership. And I think it's an important word as we get across this webinar, a partnership arrangement. So Fiona, welcome to the webinar. The floor is yours. And following your presentation, I'll be joined by Diane, Peter and Fiona for a discussion a bit more broadly around some of the themes that they've presented on today. So Fiona, over to you.
Thank you, James, and thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this webinar. I'll just say I'm the State Operations Manager for Lavande, looking after New South Wales and our villages across that state. Next slide, please. So leading on from what Diane and Peter have both said, we view the transparency in the budget process as vital to making sure that we work collaboratively with residents and we come to a conclusion of the budget process where the budget is accepted and we can move on with operating the village to the standard that residents want the village to be kept in. So our approach is very much being empathetic to the situation of residents and understanding that the majority of residents have a fixed income and that increases in the budget and the recurrent charges do impact residents greatly, and it becomes an anxious time for a lot of our residents, and we need to understand that. And what we want to do is very much work with residents to explain what are the increases and why they need to occur. So it's about us being upfront and open with those costs at the outset. What we look to do is to start the process of preparing the next year's budget in February. Our village managers will start working through obtaining quotes from various suppliers, thinking about how certain line items in a budget might need to change. We'll take on board feedback that we've heard from residents during the surveys that we conduct if we are hearing from residents in a particular village, for example, that the gardens are very much an issue, then it might be that that particular line item needs a little bit more scrutiny. So it's about explaining to residents what are the different line items in the budget. And as Peter was saying, that consistency year on year in the format of the budget as well is helpful in building an understanding within the population of a village. It might be that if we feel that the knowledge in a particular village is a little bit lacking as well, having a particular session with residents just to explain not necessarily the numbers at this point, but just what are the various categories in an operating budget. And then as a separate session a bit further on in the budget process, then putting some dollars to those different line items as well. So when we work through the budget in February, village managers will start working on those numbers. And then the ideal scenario, we're fortunate, the vast majority of our villages do have resident committees, and it's just working with those committees with those early iterations of the budget. So explaining what we have in those expense lines, but then also why certain of those lines need to change as well. Providing those budget assumptions that sit behind the numbers. We always budget with the assumption that our villages are 100% occupied, and then the majority of times we're looking to have a zero balance in the budget as well. So neither a deficit nor a surplus. We find that compiling fact sheets is also very useful, particularly around those line items such as insurance, where that amount can vary considerably year to year, depending on market conditions. And providing a summary of that, giving some information on the claims that we've had across the portfolio during the prior period, what's being seen in the insurance market, and then how that's translating to the premium changing in the year that we're budgeting for as well. Another thing that we found quite useful is to bring in the expert third party in relation to a particular expense and have them talk directly to residents as well. And in particular, having our insurance broker go around to villages, spend a good hour standing in front of residents, explaining to them about the market, about the insurance and the different types of insurances that are included in that expense line item. Then residents having the opportunity to ask questions. We've found that to be enormously beneficial in building residents' trust in the process and being open and transparent. So we're not looking to hide anything, and residents can simply ask questions directly. And often that is a simpler way of getting the message across as well. When we're not experts in a particular area such as insurance, enabling residents to be able to talk directly to the broker can lead to better clarity in that message also. Next slide, please. Now, thinking of examples of village manager good practice, what we find is those village managers who are working with residents throughout the year, so not just at the budget time, but they're constantly communicating with residents as to how the budget is tracking. They often have regular sessions, whether that be a morning coffee or a presentation in a bit more of a formal setting, but just talking through the numbers, letting residents know what the village manager is seeing in terms of costs during the year, or if there's extra work being needed in a certain section, gardening's taking up a bit more manpower because it's been particularly wet and we've needed more service visits, or it might be that there's a certain issue that's appearing in the repairs and maintenance line, and we've had to get an electrician in more than we anticipated. All of those little insights just help inform residents throughout the year. So by the time you get to the budget and setting the budget, then the movements in certain costs come as less of a surprise, and there's more understanding behind the numbers and why it's going to be required to change some of those line items in the subsequent year. Other examples of good practice is the village manager testing the pricing of established contractors. So whilst you might have a fantastic plumber, if they've been working for the village for quite some time, it's always good just to get a couple of quotes from some other providers as well and do that comparison and just making sure that they are still being competitive with their pricing. And it enables that conversation to be had as well. So if you're finding that an alternative plumber is coming back a little bit cheaper, you can go back to the incumbent and just ask them whether they're prepared to sharpen their pencil as well. Then the work with the resident committee or nominated residents, if there isn't a committee in place, is vital in our view. So it's very much working with the committee, understanding from the residents' perspective where are the pain points, helping explain and using the committee as that conduit between the wider population of a village and then the village team, just to give the background to why certain numbers are changing. And then understanding as well priorities from a resident perspective. And it might be if costs are increasing considerably in one area, that there can be some consideration to given to, can that be staged over a 2 or 3 year period? So it's understanding what are the collective goals between the resident and the village manager, what are they wanting to achieve in terms of maintenance and presentation of the village, and how is that going to be managed within the resources that are available through the operating budget. Then the Capital Works Fund and residents' contribution to that fund for the longer term maintenance, things like painting externally of buildings. It's always good to work with the committee, to work with residents, to think about and plan for how that fund is going to be used. So whilst there's a certain element for that rainy day, as Peter described, it's also residents' money to be utilised for everybody's benefit as well. So when you're putting money into that fund, it shouldn't be relied on to sort of top up your operating budget if it's falling short. It's more about what can be that structured look ahead for the next few years and what needs to be maintained. So I can think of one village, for example, where the committee had a program of let's go through the village and do a clean and a paint of the roofs. And then that's going to vastly improve the appearance of the village, and then everybody benefits from feeling that uplift as the appearance picks up of the village as well. And then it's the work is done with the committee and with the resident representatives in formulating the proposed budget for the upcoming financial year. And through that collective work, through the transparency, being open with what is included in each line item, the reasons for why numbers are changing. The aim of the village manager is to then have that endorsement from the committee to then put up a budget that the residents committee on behalf of residents is happy with. And then as the village manager puts that presentation to the population as a whole, it should be a comprehensive presentation. So going through category by category, the expenses within the budget, describing what sits within each of those line items so that residents are very clear about what's included in the budget and why there has been movement in some of those numbers. And at the conclusion of that presentation, that opportunity to ask further questions as well, so that further clarification can be given by the village manager. And this is something that we would do with our residents, regardless of whether the increase falls within CPI and therefore there isn't that resident vote required. But just to enable understand and to feel comfortable with the numbers that are included in the budget. Next slide, please. So ways in which committees and residents can support the village manager. So we know it's a stressful time throughout, really, that village budget process and time of year. So we've got a few months where residents are anxious. The village manager picks up on that. The village manager can also be a bit anxious about having to pass residents about changes and increases in costs. So just that understanding on both sides that this is probably the most difficult time of year in a village. Then that understanding that there are going to be times where there is certain information that can't be divulged, and that often is around details of individual salaries and contracts of village staff. And then I think collectively as well, it's helpful to think more about that bigger picture rather than sometimes there can be a lot of focus spent on the very small dollar amount here or there, and it's taking a bit more of an overview and that bigger picture, which helps. And then from a committee ideal working relationship with the village manager, it's very much about testing and probing, asking the village manager and getting the answers that are needed to satisfy the questions. But ultimately coming to that united front at budget presentation time. So you go through the detail together, you ask the questions, you get the answers. There's a bit of finding that common ground and working through priorities and where might money best be spent. But then prior to the final budget papers going out, before the presentation's held, it's that united front, because that provides reassurance to residents as a whole as well. We know that there's a lot of residents who aren't particularly financially savvy. They rely to a large extent on their resident committee or nominated residents who are more involved with the operator. And they're not going to be across the numbers. They're not wanting to put pressure on themselves to understand everything, but they very much rely on the advice of their elected resident committee. So having that united front, we find, is invaluable. Next slide, please. So just in conclusion, it was just really a reminder that our interests are very much aligned. Collectively, we want our villages to be safe. We want them to present well and be beautiful places for everybody to be living in. And it's very much about us wanting to work collaboratively to achieve that goal. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you, James.
That's great. Thanks, Fiona. And it's great to hear you talk it through from an operator side. Now we've got the legal side as well as Diane talking as well. So I'm going to ask if we can get all the speakers put on the screen now for the question and answer part of the webinar. We've had a number of questions come in, a lot more than I think we're going to have time to get through, but we'll do our best. I do want to reiterate the note at the top of the webinar. There's a lot of questions that have come through both in the question and the chat section. There's going to be a lot that we don't get through. Now, 2 points on that. One, we will close them out through Diane and the Education Centre, getting in contact with those people and being able to respond to the questions. And I think, Diane, we might even talk about that a little bit more at next week's webinar. If we put some of that information perhaps on the website, we can talk about that next week. And there is going to be a webinar next week that goes into some of the areas that questions have been asked about today. So some of these might be taken on notice and we might raise that with next week's panel, Diane. I can see you nodding as I talk, which is a good sign. It means we're on the same page. A number of questions we've had, though, have related to residence committees, Diane. So I want to start with that. I'm going to ask all three of you questions related to this. Village doesn't have a residence committee, Diane. I know you could fill a whole presentation on this alone. What's the best place to start to get the ball rolling with a residence committee if you don't have one in place already?
The best way to start a residence committee is, of course, to get the residents interested in forming one and knowing exactly what a residence committee will do for them. If you're a member of the RVRA, we have information sheets which will give you that information on actually the process that you go through. But basically, you get the manager to get a meeting of the residents where you discuss it. And then you take nominations for the residence committee after you've explained exactly what their roles will be, and have a meeting to vote in a residence committee. There are lots of bits and pieces that you need to consider. For example, perhaps the model rules for the residence committee, which are put out by Fair Trading, can be used to form a constitution, and you really it takes a fair bit of work. In fact, most villages would take a good year to get things together in order to form a residence committee. You've got to get those residents enthused about it, and they've got to see the great advantages to them in having a residence committee. Basically speaking, it's the right of every village to have a residence committee. If they want to have one, go ahead and do it. And you can ask us for information. We also hold workshops for our residence committees, where we go through everything that they should be doing and can't be doing and all the rest of it. And these we go around the villages that have residence committees formed. And I've taken residence committees through from their formation to their constitution to the workshops. So ask the RVRA.
And I think just an extension of that, Diane, I know you've got some video resources available on your Education Centre website that have excellent resources to really get you started with forming a committee in the steps that you said. Peter, from a legal perspective, if a village doesn't have a committee in place and the operator has to start discussing a budget, what should the residents be looking for in relation to engagement from the operator or even engagement amongst themselves where there's no committee in place?
It's hard for the operator as well, but most of the operators will try and get across, well, they have a duty to get across to all of the residents. The beauty about a residence committee, of course, is that you can shortcut a little bit of that by dealing with a residence committee and then have the residents organise the various meetings and the like. I think, as Diane said, it's really the smaller villages with low numbers of residents that generally don't have committees. But in terms of the legal parameters, it's not an easy process, and the operator's still got to run a vote around the important things and to have resident consent and the like, but particularly around changes to services or where the budget's beyond CPI. So in some respects, the residents committee, I think, makes it easier across the board where you've got a representative. And it's about where you have no representative, it's about trying to get across the resident population as a whole to get them to understand what's happening.
Yeah, great. We've had a question on the slides from today's presentation. This, as well as a video of this, I believe, Diane, we're going to package up and stick on the website as well. So any questions related to that, you'll be able to go and review after the fact. Fiona, I'm going to finish with you before I move on from Residents Committee. You've got quite a large number of villages, big, small, and everything in between across your portfolio and your remit. What's your advice to residents that might be in a village when there's not committee with regards to engaging with the operator in and around the village budget?
Yeah, it's tricky. Obviously, ask questions directly of your village manager. I mean, what we would normally encourage is the communication is predominantly done between the village manager and the committee, and that keeps the process more efficient. But where there is no committee, then you should most definitely just ask questions directly of the village manager, and the village manager might want to then, if there's a large volume of similar inquiries coming through, find a way to communicate back to residents. But yes, it's about keeping everybody informed is the tricky part where there's no committee.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's certainly come across from what everyone's saying. Keep people informed, keep it transparent, keep it clear and upfront along the way. We've had a few interesting questions come in around this concept of CPI. It's the great figure that everyone works to when it comes to a budget. And Peter, if you don't mind, I'm gonna direct this question at you based on your experience of having seen where it probably goes wrong. So does the CPI mean that I'm an operator, I put out a budget at CPI? Does that mean I don't have to respond to resident requests for information as much as I would if I was going over and above CPI?
I think operators still need to respond to resident questions. The only difference is that the village budget is deemed to be approved where it doesn't exceed the CPI. It puts the onus back onto the resident if they have problems to take it to the tribunal ultimately if they can't get it resolved with the operator. But I think because it does streamline the budgetary process, I think a lot of operators would be well advised to still explain the various line items of the budget, as Heidi mentioned, particularly with the CPI budgets, to ensure that residents are across what are the year-on-year changes. Because sometimes what you'll get in a CPI budget is you'll get no overall change, but you'll get change between line items. So there still can be questions that are fielded from residents around, well, this has gone up, we understand this has gone down. It still should generate a discussion on a collaborative basis around how the end result comes out the way it does.
Fiona, would you agree with that? You're doing a CPI budget, requests for additional information, clarifying information are coming in from the residents. Would your expectation be that your village manager is responding to those with the same level of detail if it was going above CPI as well?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and there's a few. The reason I asked that, there's a couple of questions that weave in and around that theme, so it allows me to tick off a couple of inquiries at the same time. But it's very clear that CPI or not, a request for information is still a request for information that the operator has to respond to. And I think, Peter, you said within 10 days. I think that was sort of the business rule that we were talking to earlier on in the piece, which is fantastic. I'm just conscious of time. Does everyone mind if we go about 5 minutes over? I think we've got a few more questions here. I'll get a few nodding heads. I know we're going to do this all again next week, but I wouldn't mind just ticking off some of these other questions that we've got coming through. So Peter, staying with you while you've got the floor, what are the common pitfalls that you see coming across your desk to where budgets are being escalated from a legal perspective? And then does it always need to go from 0 to 100 in the sense of, escalating it at the village level, get yourself involved as a lawyer, and then we're at the tribunal? Or is there some sort of mediation intermediary that residents can approach the operator in order to resolve matters?
I think there's two parts to your question. The first part of what are the major issues. My experience is there's been over time issues that go to maintenance costs in budgets and how at two levels. One, the rise in the cost, but it can also be whether it's an item that's properly constructed as maintenance and it's not replacement. So what I mean by that is that there may be some claims for costs in a budget where residents might say, well, that's really a replacement of the item of capital, not maintenance. So you've got these issues in the Act, and they can become quite legalistic. The other element is particularly around head office costs or corporate head office costs, where those costs are assigned where there's multiple villages with a large operator, and the operator trying to explain and the residents trying to understand how those costs relate to that particular village. I think there's a strong case, and I'm not sure whether the OFT still do it in New South Wales, but they do have some form of mediation service, and I know there's various community justice centres that have mediation services and these things. And I think as an area, that's an area that operators and residents committee should look at more closely to try and resolve disputes rather than go off to NCAT. At the front end of the NCAT, they try to resolve it through some sort of mediation or conciliatory process. But once you're there, the parties are fairly well invested. So it's often a good idea to see if there's alternatives to getting there to try and cut it off at the pass.
Yeah. And Diane, I saw you nodding there. Have you got anything to add to that?
Just that mediation is the way to go if possible, because NCAT can be extremely stressful for older people. It can sometimes get to cost a bit in legal fees too, but it's the stress and the length of time that it takes, and older people just find it very difficult to deal with. So mediation if possible.
Yep. And coming across your desk, Diane, so obviously you presented that report at the top of the webinar where you showed just the number of inbound inquiries that you get. I think you picked the month of May 2025. And I think conversations we've had in preparing for this, you really start to see those spike around budget matters leading into sort of May. So obviously February, March, April, May is kind of budget season in village land. And then again, when we get to the annual management meetings in October, from the data you're collecting, are you seeing the situation improve overall, remain about the same? Or have we got some sort of, serial offenders that these sorts of webinars would really help out both ends, both the operator end and the resident end? Yes
to all of that. The problem is that okay, we just seem to find every year that May it starts and our members are sending in lots of queries about their budgets, which is good. And also it tapers off June, July, where they're questioning perhaps something that's gone through in the budget, and perhaps they're having a look at the budget and perhaps it's been rejected or something like that. And yes, again, at the annual management meeting time, because people don't seem to understand the annual management meeting and that it's not the AGM. It's a bit of a difficulty really calling it an AAM and AGMs, and everybody gets bound up with all of these initials. But in actual fact, that annual management meeting is extremely important, and especially since the audited accounts are going to be presented, it's another time for residents to really get on top of what's happening as far as their money is concerned. And the other thing that we're noticing is that in some villages, collaboration with the management, as Fiona has outlined, is very good. That the relationship between the residents committee or the finance subcommittee and the management is excellent, and they can iron out a lot of these problems themselves. But we're finding increasingly that some villages, even the residents committee, is not on top of their job. They don't really know what they're supposed to be doing and what they can't be doing. And so as a general thing, we're finding that there are residents committees that are just not performing properly, which is a great shame, because they could be a marvellous vehicle for the residents to get to understand their budgets in particular.
Yeah. And I think on the point of understanding budgets, I think, Fiona, the way you worded it was around actually not just waiting for budget season to spend time talking about dollars and cents with residents. And I think you were talking around a bit more sort of that best practice approach to this because I got the sense your view was that you should always be talking about the numbers to actually make the transparency something that happens 365 days of the year and not just for 60 to 90 days as we get to that sort of one May deadline. So can you talk through some of the practices and the business discipline you're looking to instill with your team that you think could help if replicated in other villages elsewhere?
Yeah, so I think it's when those quarterly accounts are published, making sure that there's adequate description as to any changes and variations from budget at the end of each quarter. And then the best practice that I see is these regular get-togethers that a village manager will organise. And they might not just be solely focused on the finances. They can be updates about what's going on around the village generally. They're a bit of a social get-together as well. They're that chance for residents to ask questions about any aspect of life in the village. So when finances are discussed in that type of forum, you find that the attendance can often be better than if it's a specific event that's purely about finance, which can be a dry topic for some. So it's about using different ways of getting the message through the village manager understanding their residents. We know every village is different, every village has its own culture, but what's the best method for a particular village manager to work with their community to best explain and get the message out to everybody? And it's very much about enabling residents to understand better what sits in the budget, how the financials, the actuals are tracking, and through that constant updating, residents being better informed, I think it takes away a fair amount of the anxiety, takes away the surprises at budget time, and it enables both village teams and residents to work more closely together and on the outcomes that both parties are wanting to achieve.
And this then goes above just producing quarterly financial reports for your residents, which becomes a very much transactional engagement whereby produce report, questions come in, respond to questions. It actually allows you to have a conversation with all residents and really make sure so that when the budget time comes around, you've got a higher level of knowledge in the room to be discussing these sort of topics with the residents. And hopefully it means you get better questions from the residents as well, more informed questions coming through from the residents.
That's right. Yeah.
Absolutely. Peter, we've had a couple of people make questions just around, you know, the Act. Let's be honest, it's not always the easiest document to read. Then you've got the regulations that sit behind it. You've got to read the two together. I've been reading it for 2 decades and I'm still caught out with new things whenever you look at it because there's just so much to it. Is there a plain English or single source of truth that folk on the call, if they wanted to explore a certain topic, where should they be going? Because I'm getting a lot of questions around the Act's confusing. Where should I go for more information?
Look, there's a fair amount of free information from the Office of Fair Trade website around some of the changes that have come in, where they explain it. I know the RVRA that are pretty good. Each of the amendments usually have explanatory memo exercise to sort of locate it and go through what the underlying intent is. There's probably a case in due course to sort of look at the Act and step back all the players and come to a view about how the Act itself could be simplified. And it's an Act that's a bit like an orchard that's had trees that have been sort of grafted and different genetics over time with different issues and pressures that have come. So there's certainly a reform area there. But in terms of resource material, there's a fair amount of things that are on the net. And if you are half computer savvy, you can Google a lot of different articles, particularly from academics and certainly barristers and solicitors that talk about some of the changes that have come through on the system. But the starting point is probably the RVRA Education Centre, and probably have a look at some of the information sheets that the OFT put out. That'd be my steer.
That's a great plug, Diane. You'll have to give Peter $50 at the end
Yeah.
of this for that plug at the end of the
Thank you,
call.
Peter.
Diane, I might go to the last question for you because I'm conscious we're a little bit over time. What sort of resources can the people on the call find through your education centre? And what's the best way to reach out to contact you if they want any more information about the RVRA New South Wales?
Our education centre is, of course, funded by the New South Wales government, and it's open to everyone. Everyone can utilise the resources that are actually in with the education centre. The resource sheets that accompany the videos, for example, are very useful. Now, Peter was talking about some of our resources, which are reserved for members of the RVRA. We have 35 information sheets, and they go to a variety of legislative things, such as looking at the budget and what you should be looking for, and the accounts and meetings, etc., etc. So, as far as the education centre is concerned, we have a lot of information on work on residence committees, workshops, and quite a few videos, series of videos about coming into a village, leaving a village, about costs associated with going into a village, staying in a village, and leaving a village, and of course residence committees and things like the webinars, which are also put up on that site. So if you just Google RVRA or go into rvra.gov.au /education, you'll come to the education centre.
Great. Thank you, Diane. And look, I do want to thank Peter, Diane, and Fiona for their time this morning. Diane for organising this webinar. We do have another one coming up next week, so I'm going to ask if we can put the slide up. If you haven't registered, please register for the second webinar. There are a lot of questions that were raised in the chat and the Q&A today, which will actually be addressed at next week's webinar, where we talk a lot more around the practice, the process, certainly some of the discussions around reporting and requests for information and those sorts of things. We'll go into a little bit more detail on that next week. So hopefully you will be joining us then. But thank you so much for your time, for joining us. I think the real thing that comes back for me is where this is successful, where you see this work really well, where there is a partnership relationship between the residents and the operator, and that does extend to village manager and the staff on the ground. That partnership mentality cannot be understated. And I think if all parties go into any form of financial or budgetary process with a partnership mentality, I think we come out of it the better side. Yes, it's stressful for all involved. No one likes to put costs up, and we're all looking at our hip pocket at the moment, those on the call included. So everyone, please, thank you so much for joining us this morning. It was a delight having you with us. We look forward to having you joining us again next Tuesday, the 10th of February at 10:30 a.m, where we look at budgets in practice, where we're talking checking, meeting and collaborating. Have a wonderful day. Thank you for joining us.